next one really is this Germantown, the South 4th and 5th Avenue study that was done. And so I bring this one up because to me it shows the relationship with Planning Commission. So by way of brief background, in July, Planning held, July of 2009, the Planning Commission held a hearing on City Place site plan for 5th Avenue. And this plan calls for demolition of 7 houses. Right. And both the Planning Commission and Council approved this because it's a matter of right. It's not a special building. It fills in with all the requirements, right?
With the zoning requirements.
With the zoning requirements. Right. And you, Ellen, spoke at the Planning Commission as an individual, not as
a spokesperson for the,
right. And you spoke in favor of a moratorium, saying, you know, just back up and let's see what's going to happen. And then a month later, Council did call for a moratorium and then a historic study committee for the 4th and 5th. And in this, Council set the boundaries. How typical, maybe you can tell me, Norm, how typical is it for Council to set the boundaries of a historic study as opposed to the committee?
Yeah, that's not unusual because Council is the one that officially sets up the study committee. They appoint the people, they set the boundaries, and they say, bring us a report. And that report has some legal basis to the decision that will be made on whether there's a historic district or not. And so Council has listened to people in that particular district or neighborhood saying we'd like to be considered as for a historic district. And I'm sure there's discussion between the neighborhood and Council people about what the boundaries should be. But then they give the directive that we want to have a study of the buildings there, and we want to have a report on their historic significance, and then we'll decide whether we want to go ahead or not.
I think that it's kind of interesting because you reminded me about Broadway, the Broadway Historic, and there the group doing the study set the boundaries, which seems much more reasonable than if you don't know where the historic district really should be, to have those who are not familiar with the rules and regulations to be setting it. But you're saying that it's not unusual for Council to set it.
Council can give that authority to the study committee as well, yeah. And I think that's probably a wise thing to do.
To give it to those,
to the study committee to establish the boundaries.
Correct. Yeah. And in this case, the Planning Commission, the study group went before the Planning Commission in April. And the Planning Commission stated clearly that they had no voting authority over the recommendation, but they questioned the 2 leads of the study committee for approximately an hour, and listening to it, once again, this is televised, you can hear, really gave the impression that they were against a historic designation. And I was just wondering, Norm, if you could give some justifications, maybe 3 or 4, that would be the top reasons for having a historic district.
I think integrity is probably the word that you would use first, that the district has some integrity, and that's something that is judged by the state. So if the city sets up a study committee and they bring a report to Council and Council approves it, it still has to go to the state for final approval. And what they're looking for is, are the boundaries appropriate? Is there integrity, and is there enough significance? And that's a very important word in preservation, is the level of significance, because there are a lot of old buildings around, and not all old buildings should be designated and protected.
Right.
And so what you're looking for is 2 kinds of significance. One is the architectural significance of the building, and the other is historical significance. And there are many buildings that have a very strong sense of history for the local community or the state or the national, and they're worth saving in that respect. And if we go way back to the beginning, I'll pull out one interesting case study, George Washington's home, Mount Vernon.
Yeah.
It was falling apart. In the 1850s, it was falling apart. And Anne Pamela Cunningham went to Congress and said, we should preserve this house. And Congress told her, we don't do that. They don't give money to preserve buildings. And so it became a private effort. And I think even a building of tremendous significance, and nobody on the Congress at that time in the 19th century would have argued the significance of the building.
Right.
But even then, the significance didn't matter. So I think significance is really one of those things that become very important to think about as you look at a historic district.
And is one of the questions that the Planning Commission brought up was that saying that it's approximate, the period they were looking at was approximately 100 years, I think a little over, as being unreasonable. Is that unreasonable in a historic district to say we're looking at a period, you know, homes for 100?
Well, in that particular area, you had buildings that were among the very first,
Yes.
1840s, early buildings in Ann Arbor, and the additions to those buildings were much later. So you had a primary structure that was so early, and then you had an addition that was maybe 50 years later, and then another addition another 50 years
Right.
later. So you did have this broad span, and the changes that occurred in that district stopped at about World War II, and that's why it was a 100-year span.
Right, right.
The last changes occurred
Right.
at about the 1940s,
Right.
and so you had from 1840 to 1940 an area being changing, evolving, and
Yes.
then stopping, and so that was a natural point at which to say this is the end of that period of significance.
Right. It just seemed interesting when they brought up, when the planning brought up 100 years as being under,
too long,
because
yes.
Broadway
Yes.
is also
a very long,
Yes,
yes.
it's a very long. And there was once again this thought that the impact on the master plan and the stifling of growth and density seems to come up repeatedly if you have a historic district. So. Did the Historic District Commission take a position on the study?
They did as individuals. There were 2 members of the Historic District Commission that were on the study
Yes.
committee. And there was just not a consensus of opinion on the commission as to how the commission should act, whether we should act as a body or whether we should act individually, and we've ended up choosing to act individually.
Right. So as it now stands, they believe that the developer will not demolish the house. There's this feeling that he won't go ahead. He has the right to do it. And are there, is there any comments on the impact of the loss of this historic designation? Do you see any as a loss for the community?
Well, I think it is. I think that particularly that neighborhood as a very urban neighborhood and a dense neighborhood with houses that are very close together, very walkable, and houses that were large to begin with, so they've been divided into apartments and consequently hold more people than a family of 4. You have those ingredients that you would like for urban neighborhoods. And not only do you have the density, but you have the historic character that really does lend that street, or all of those streets in that area, a real sense of place that I think people in town identify with, visitors identify with. I think that block of 5th Street is photographed. It's on the cover of the Ann Arbor Observer from time to time, and that speaks to us of our historic heritage.
Right.
I think Ellen's idea of the fact that it represents the character of Ann Arbor is a very important issue. That when people think of Ann Arbor, they're thinking of places like we have in that neighborhood, and we can compare it to the Old West Side, where the old, relatively moderate style German houses were being demolished for modern apartment blocks for students. And it was destroying the character of the Old West Side. And fortunately, before too many of those apartment buildings got built, they established the Old West Side District, which put an end to that. As a result, the Old West Side Historic District is one of the most desirable areas in the city to live.
Yes.
And has kept its property values up through the recession. When all the suburban areas are losing property values like crazy, the Old West Side has kept its property values. It's a very desirable neighborhood.